Hello, and welcome to TV Toastmasters. My name is JD Chandler, and I'll be your host for this segment that I like to call Writers Readers, where I talk with Portland authors about their books, about the writing process, about Portland history, and about my upcoming book, Portland Rogues Gallery, coming from Font Hill Media in February 21. My guest today is JB Fisher. I've known JB for a few years now. In fact, we wrote a book together a few years back called Portland on the Tape, where we looked at the infamous 1950 Joanne Dewey murder and connected it to some unsolved crimes that had happened in Portland a few years before that. He has a new book out called Echo of Distant Waters, where he talks about the disappearance of the Martin family in 1958. This is an authentic Portland mystery that has baffled the city for more than 60 years. So JB, why don't you tell us who the Martin family were and what happened to them in December 1958?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, JD. So the Martins lived in Northeast Portland, family of six. There were three young daughters, and then the father, Ken, and mother, Barbara. And then there was an older brother named Don, who was off in the Navy back east in 1958 when the family went out apparently to go look for Christmas greens out in the Columbia River Gorge, December 7th, 1958, and never returned. That's a baffling mystery, as you mentioned, in part because two of the girls, the youngest two, did turn up in the Columbia River in the spring of 1959, but the parents and the other daughter, the older daughter, are still missing, as is the car. So it's continued to be a real head scratcher as far as what actually happened to them. The official explanation at the time, after a huge investigation, really one of the largest, if not the largest, missing person investigations in Oregon history. The official explanation was that there'd been an accident over at the old locks at Cascade Locks, that they'd accidentally driven into the river. But as we'll probably be talking about here in just a little bit, one particular detective really followed a different trail and ended up piecing together a much darker explanation involving foul play, based on a number of clues and coincidences that he had picked up on.
Yeah, I read your book recently. It was the second time through, and I've read parts of it while you were writing it. But the thing that struck me is it's a gripping book. Not only is it a bizarre story about what seems to be the typical Portland family from the 1950s, almost an Ozzie and Harriet type family, and totally disappeared. And the theory of the accident seems to prevail, although it doesn't really make a lot of sense at all. In fact, one of the scenes in your book that really struck me was when you were having lunch with the old timers there at the Locks Museum, and none of them believed that anybody had ever driven into the locks there.
That was an interesting experience, because I sat down with people and just sort of casually asked, what does anyone think about that? And they literally laughed at the idea. And then one of them promptly sort of said, "Oh no, actually up at the Dalles is where that happened," which is part of what these clues pointed to as foul play. And part of it too, I always like to say that the accident theory is much harder to substantiate than the foul play theory. There are just really so many elements involved in the foul play theory, and yet with the accident, it's hard. You actually really have to stretch it to come up with much of anything.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a compelling part of it.
Yeah. And it happened right before Christmas, and it electrified the city, would you say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a huge search involving something like 5 different police jurisdictions, because at first no one knew where they went.
Right.
So they were looking all over Southwest Washington and West Oregon, all around in parts of Hood River, Columbia Gorge area, but also Mount Hood and even out to the coast. So there was just a lot of investigation and a lot of interest. I mean, it was just daily headline kinds of stories about what had happened to them. And when clues did start coming in, of course, that was especially gripping. But at first, there were actually very few, and it took a while before anyone had any idea where they even went.
Right. Yeah, and that's the amazing thing, is that it just seemed to be a disappearance into thin air. I think that's what really caught people's attention, is just no clue to what actually happened to these people. And some people probably bought the accident story, but I think very few people actually bought that story.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting one too, because of course at Christmas time, I mean, and you had a family, like you said, that was sort of the quintessential 50s family. Ken would dress up as Santa Claus for the neighbor kids, and their street was actually called Candy Lane because he would decorate they made candy canes out of wood for every house on the block, sort of a predecessor to Peacock, or maybe it was at the same time as Peacock, but
Right.
at a similar place. And so, the idea that they would just disappear, of course, is baffling, but also that idea that, if there was a darker side to it, the coverage sort of pushed it back toward it was an accident at
Right.
the locks, because, who would want to hear such a dark tale right around
Right.
Christmas, especially involving a Santa figure. So,
Right. And there were a lot of dark leads to this story. They found a gun with blood on it. They found an abandoned car. Witnesses possibly saw someone with the family at one point. So it is possible to put together what happened, it seems like.
The abandoned car was linked to two ex-cons who were seen at this restaurant in Hood River where the Martins were that afternoon at the same time, and that was the last place the Martins were seen. So there was that, and then there was discovery of tire tracks going off a cliff at the Dalles, and the tire tracks matched the vehicle. So there was,
also paint scrapings, weren't there, on the
paint
rocks?
scrapings on the rock.
And so there was that criminal was named Ray Light, who had he had pulled off a kidnapping in a car in a similar way to the way you suggest it might have happened with the Martin family.
And so one of the things that gets really mysterious about this case is just at every turn, there's sort of big question marks as far as the crime scene, as far as motives and all of that. And so one of them is even who these ex-cons were, and there's a question of whether this character who was a fugitive in the spring of '59, who kidnapped a police chief and shot a police chief and kidnapped another police officer down in Brownsville, Oregon, whether he was the same person. And in fact, when we were talking about the detective who was on this trail, that was one of the things he was looking into, was he actually had a photograph that was the same person who was later involved in an FBI. He was a top 10 FBI wanted individual in '59. So there's some really weird stuff about it, but there's also, just as as this detective was finding himself, these coincidences were just stacking up in ways that were just more than just random, or if there were one or two, like a gun and that was it, or an abandoned car linked to two ex-cons, it would probably be something like, well, that can happen. I mean, it's a big place and there's a lot going on, right? But all these things end up coming together in such a way that it really paints a very different picture.
And it does. It paints a very interesting picture when you start putting these things together. I want to talk a little bit. I know this has been a very personal case for you. You've been working on the story as long as I've known you. But I want to get into this detective that you've been referring to. His name was Walter Graven. He was a detective with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Department. And why don't you tell us a little bit about who Graven was and why he's so important in your case?
Yeah, so Walter Graven grew up in Eastern Oregon, and came to Portland. I guess initially he was working in the shipyards as a security officer during World War II, and then he answered an ad to join the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, and moved up pretty quickly in the ranks to become a detective. And so in the late 40s and early 50s, he was working on a number of intriguing criminal cases. And then he came upon the Martin case, initially involved in looking into credit card activity on the family's credit card to see if there was anything going on once they disappeared. But pretty shortly into it, he started to, as he said, find other things. Like he learned about this gun kind of later on from law enforcement. The gun, by the way, was found in about January of 1959, just along the side of the highway, and it was found by a civilian who turned it over to the Hood River sheriff, who promptly gave it back without investigating. And then Graven learned about it later on, but the interesting piece of that was that he had early on had actually gone to the department store where the older brother in the family, Don Martin, had worked, and learned that a gun had gone missing from there. And so later on, when he came to find out about the gun, he also came to realize that the serial number matched the serial number on the gun from the department store. So he was involved in that. He was involved in finding the cliff tire tracks and testing those. Later on in May of 1959, when the two youngest daughters turned up in the river, Graven learned from some barge operators doing work out there that they had hit upon something large and metal that they described as like a car. right before the girls turned up down river, and Detective Graven was convinced, based on the math, that the flow of the river and everything else, that would make sense, that that hitting on the car with the anchor disturbed it and dislodged the two smallest girls that came out at that point. So he was involved in this, and also in searching the river with divers at that spot. So he was really pursuing this, and he really didn't give up on it. He was actually, by the end of by the time this was wrapping up in summer of 1959, his superiors were telling him, lay off this case.
Yeah.
This isn't your jurisdiction. This isn't your business to be looking into. He pretty much continued for the rest of his life to pursue this case in one way or another, and his descendants, who I came to know,
Yes.
his grandson Greg and his daughter Gloria, have certainly talked about how much this case meant to him for the rest of his life. And in fact, right before he died in 1988, he turned over the files to the Dallas Police Department and said, Portland police were too corrupt for me to solve this case, but it's really your business to look into this.
Now, I know that Graven's notebooks were a big source for you on this, and you were lucky to get quite a lot of his work.
Yeah, that came kind of serendipitously, along with a number of other things that, at that point, I had, when I had first gotten into this case, I came to realize that Greg Graven, the grandson, was a police officer over in Yamhill, Oregon, and he was eventually able to put me in touch with his aunt, Gloria Graven,
Right.
who is the daughter of Walter Graven, who had gone with her father when she was a teenager on some of the searches, and actually had a suitcase full of all of his notebooks and papers, and she has loaned that to me, and that's been just an amazing source of information, because it really does have the feeling that he left this trail hoping that someone in the future would pick it up.
That's one of the things. One of the things that fascinates me about this Walter Graven is he was on the sheriff's department from the end of World War II up until 1968. Is that correct?
That's right.
And he never let go of this case.
Yeah.
He lived almost 20 years after he retired, and he constantly kept working on it, talking about it, working with Ann Sullivan from the Oregonian and other people to try and solve this case that he never was able to. But the thing that really strikes me, now we use Walter Graven's notebooks for our book, Portland on the Take, as well, because he looked into the Dewey and Podless cases. So I've read some of his work, and I'm familiar with the source that you're using here. But he ran into the same issues with that case that he ran into with this case, where he was warned off, received death threats, had people watching his house during the investigation. So this wasn't the only time, and I suspect there might be other cases where he ran into similar situations.
Yeah, it's interesting. His daughter, actually, on our recent podcast that we did over at Coin TV, there were some sound bites from an interview that had been done with Gloria Graven a while back, I think in 2008, during the anniversary of the disappearance. And she emphasizes, talking about her father, how he had pretty much been not only so committed to this case, but it was, had been that way with other cases, but in every other case he was able to solve it to some extent.
Right.
And this one was really about the only one that was left unsolved. But at the same time, she said, he was always really committed to getting to the truth of these cases. And I think with what we found with the Podless, Schultz, and Joanne Dewey, it was a similar dynamic where, certain elements of law enforcement were more committed to getting to the true bottom of it than others, right? And so I think you see that happening there as well, right? That there were certain ways in which, not paying attention to key details, or kind of shifting.
We saw the same thing in the Frank Tatum murder case, where a person was killed in a bar that was owned by Jim Elkins, the vice lord, and the police department did everything they could to isolate that so that it wouldn't get back to Elkins.
They keep it very, very narrowly focused, which is what happened with this case too, with the Martins, because essentially you had multiple jurisdictions, but it's really the Hood River Sheriff who kept it so directly focused on Hood River County and the location at Cascade Locks, and kept it away from the Dalles. And that was really a consistent element. Even beyond, when the case was reopened in the late 60s by the Oregon State Police at the asking of the governor at that point, Tom McCall, who knew Ann Sullivan, was friends with her in journalism school, and basically said, okay, I'll help you publicize this with your, she was doing an article at that time. And, so he went to the Oregon State Police, had them reopen the case, and sure enough, even then, it was pretty much turned right back to the accident
Yeah.
at Cascade Locks, even though at that point there was even more sort of coalescing of different theories and ideas through these clues into something more
Well, and in
substantive.
your book, you talk about a very good reason why the police agencies were interested in keeping this undercover. And it had to
Yeah,
do with Cliff Bennett, who had a brothel out in Dallasport and was well
yeah,
connected in Portland. But we're getting close to the end of our time, and I want to talk with you a little bit about the writing process itself. This
mhm,
has been a very personal case for you, I know,
yeah,
and you've been
yeah,
working on it for a long time. In fact, you took a break from it for a short period so you could write our book,
that's right.
Portland on the Take. But the whole time you were doing that, it was like you were collecting the information that you needed to understand what happened later. So
That's
tell
right.
me, what helped you keep your focus and helped you finish this book, even though it took you several years?
Yeah, it was interesting because, that part of it was the materials that I gathered, especially the notebooks and items from Walter Graven, but also, other kinds of materials. I found stuff that when I came to know the family that lives in the Martin house now, they had found this box of some of their belongings that was stashed in sort of a hidden cabinet in the wall, and stuff like that just really kept me kind of focused on this idea that there was almost a sort of supernatural element of this story just needs to be told, and I need to
Hmm.
keep sticking with it because these people, not just the family but this detective as well, need some closure to this. And so that's definitely a big piece of it. I mean, part of it too was that my process of writing this involved doing the detective work. Like, I think most of the time when people are writing this kind of work, we all do
Hmm.
that to some extent, right? We kind of figure it out as we go along,
Right,
but especially in a case like this where it was so unsolved that
right.
you find yourself just picking up on trails. And I think part of that too is having resources like the digital Oregonian archive and now the Oregon Journal.
Yeah.
It enables a kind of connecting the dots that just wasn't possible before.
Absolutely. And that is one of the things I wanted to talk with you about is we've had the Oregonian, the digital Oregonian archives now for quite a
Mhm.
long time. And I
Yeah,
think you and I are both very familiar with what the Oregonian has to say about
yeah,
most of the things that we're interested in. But
yeah.
now we have the Oregon Journal and we have a lot of the local Oregon newspapers that are
Mhm.
available to us. How has that changed the way you are able to look at these things?
Well, it's particularly interesting for me because especially the current project I'm working on, which is not entirely separate since it's the same era and really involves some of the same civic corruption that you were talking about,
Mhm.
alluding to with why this case probably wasn't solved. But the fact of the matter is, you have, especially in the 50s, these two rival papers, the Oregonian and the Oregon Journal, that were really kind of on the separate. They were sort of on opposite sides politically, so at least to some extent, and seeing kind of different stories through several lenses can really be illuminating. And I think part of it too is for the story I'm telling right now, which is sort of about how the Oregonian and the Oregon Journal were
Mhm.
vying to tell the correct story. There's a third piece which I have, which is these files out of the Oregon State Archives from the Oregon State Police that were investigating the Portland Vice, and they were investigating the probe that the Oregonian and the Portland Police Bureau were
Right.
doing. And that's such an interesting process because it's basically involved a kind of triangulating where you can take
Yeah.
both the Oregonians and the Oregon Journal story and then check it against these other files and say, okay, you know what? Now neither of them are quite telling it like it is, but with
Yes.
all three together, now suddenly it really comes into view. And so
Exactly.
that's
What
been really, it's been quite a experience
I
to
kind of think of it almost as a binary vision because reading just one source and checking it against the
Mhm.
census and all of the other
Yeah,
sources that we have available gives you a view and you can make assumptions and you can make decisions. But then suddenly you
yeah,
have this other point of view and it's like now you have both eyes and
yeah, yeah,
the image kind of pops forward and you can see a
yeah.
lot more of what's actually going
Yeah, and it gives it what I mean, it's something that's interesting I found in part because, there's a tendency for some of the discoveries, especially about civic corruption, to be sort of brushed aside as, oh, that's just conspiracy theory. But
on.
when you really start to have all these different lenses to look through, then suddenly it's really like pulling up the carpet. It's like you see kind of what's below and you think, oh boy, if I keep pulling this up, this is
Yeah,
going to get messy. And it's not conspiracy theory. It's stuff
right.
that's right there. But the reason we haven't been able to see it is all that carpet's been laid down so neatly by all these different sources. And
Yeah.
so
Well, this
it's
is one thing that I've learned from working with you, JB, is if you pull on any loose thread in unsolved murder in Portland, or sometimes even the solved ones, you will
Yeah.
find the organized crime
Yeah,
that's
I
been
know.
in charge of the city for decades.
Yeah, yeah. It's like
Because
I always like to say, corruption is the system. I mean, I know that sounds a little radical, but I think there is something to that. Even
I
just
think there is definitely something to that. Yes, and I've recently been with the Oregon Journal. I've been expanding my look so I can look a little more at the state than not just
yeah,
Portland. And I'm finding it's a lot the same in a lot of other cities. I
Mhm.
found some great scandal in Coos County and also
Mm,
in Jackson County. So
mm.
I'll probably be writing about that in the next few years.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine. I mean, there's just so much so many stories to tell too. That's the other thing about digging in the ways that we do. That you can just sometimes, just finding an article next to the one you're looking at. It's
Yeah,
always been that way in libraries, but now it's sort of amped up to.
exactly. Well, and that's the other thing. Whenever I look at a newspaper article, I don't want to read just the article itself. I want to read everything that's on the page around it.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
make
exactly.
incredible connections. You never know what you're going to find.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's an exciting process.
it
And
is.
you and I have also been to the city and state archives, and we've found interesting things just poking around.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and the
In
police.
fact, I remember the day at the police museum when you found Rollick Crick's reporter's notebook like magic.
Yeah, yeah,
I just looked
yeah.
through all that stuff and didn't see it.
Yeah, yeah, it's just and that's the kind of thing too, where then you take that and you check addresses, for example,
Yep.
against addresses and that you can easily search in the digital archives, and it's like, wait a minute, that's a whole different story. We didn't even think of that one, but now suddenly I know about these other people and what they're up to. Yeah,
We're just about out of time, but the last thing I want to talk about is the now reporters have been behind this story for decades now. Anne
yeah,
Sullivan in the 1960s, Margie Boulay in the 80s,
in the 90s,
and
yeah.
Jeff Gianola
Mhm,
at Coin
mhm.
TV. And then you and Jeff have recently done a podcast on the Coin
Yeah,
podcast network that is well worth checking out. There's 3 parts of it now. There's going to be a 4th, I understand.
yeah, I think on Tuesday. I think
Okay,
on
great. And people who
Tuesday.
are interested in this case should definitely check out this podcast. It's excellent, excellent information on the case.
Thank you.
But to me, it seems like it's almost a relay. Uh,
Yeah,
Walter Graven handed off to Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan handed off to, I'm not even sure who the next person was because there's so many people involved.
yeah,
And
yeah.
a lot of people have been interested. So there's been a lot of amateur investigators.
Mhm,
One of
mhm.
them is this guy who found that gun, right? That's Donald Bain.
Actually, he helped find the tire tracks. The
Oh,
guy
he
who
found
found
the
the gun
tire
was,
tracks.
yeah, but he spent a lot of time walking around in the gorge
He was
searching.
searching. He was trying to find some clue to what happened to this family in his
Yeah,
neighborhood.
yeah.
And one of the things that you write about him, and I'm looking at this so I can quote it, Donald Bain knew that dedication and almost obsessive persistence were key to solving the case. It
Mhm.
seems to me that dedication and an almost obsessive persistence is what it's taken to write the book too. Am I right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's kind of an interesting one too because it's really not done. I mean, we have this, you mentioned the different generations, and it was interesting because it was like it was always a little team, with it was Walter Graven, Ann Sullivan, and Donald Bain, and then this lieutenant from the Oregon State Police, and a couple divers, and the same with Margie Belay. There were several divers and others, and still that way now. We have a diver, this guy named Scott Holbert, who's
Yes.
an expert wreck diver. And he's been out there and is convinced that with the right attention to it and persistence, we can figure that out. So that's part of it. Is it's been interesting because it's certainly like with the book, there was a recognition at a certain point in the book that obviously I wasn't going to solve it in the sense of like putting closure to it, but in a way that was actually a positive element to me because it was sort of like, oh, this is the kind of story that kind of like DB Cooper, but
Yeah.
a little bit more in the way of substantive elements that we can come back to, and like for example a site that we can dive and search. I mean, I guess DB Cooper has a site too, but it's so this one though does have an element where we can really continue the story, and I think
Well, but it's kind of deceptive because it's such a small area, but it's an incredibly complex area, and a
it is
station wagon has completely disappeared into it, it seems.
super deep. I mean, it's up to 200 feet deep at parts. Super
And your
fast
stories
current.
of searching the river are fascinating. It's a great book. Everyone should read it.
Thank you.
We're out of time now, but I will remind everyone that it's Echo of Distant Water is the book, and the Coin Podcast Network has a lot more information on it in your podcast series. And I'm going to ask you back for our next segment where we'll talk about my book. And thank you, JB. I appreciate it today.
Thanks, JD.
All right.
I joined Toastmasters to improve my speaking, listening, communication, and leadership skills.
Toastmasters gave me
incredible confidence,
confidence,
great listening skills,
poise,
great leadership skills,
leadership skills,
the ability to speak in public,
strength,
a captive audience,
quality feedback from the more experienced Toastmasters.
Toastmasters really helped me improve my listening skills.
sales skills,
opportunities to go to different groups and widen my whole horizon.
Toastmasters has given me a more focused me, and I'm a much better listener. Toastmasters is fulfilling.
It's a great place to fail your way to success.
wonderful way to meet people,
networking,
strength.
It's addictive.
It's a club of self-improvement.
It's an experience, it's a ride that you won't forget, and you'll enjoy it every step of the way.
Toastmasters helped me land a kick-butt job.
I sang at one of my table topic speeches, and people liked it and applauded.
My business is doing great, and I'm very, very grateful to Toastmasters.
It's been a great experience for me.
Thank you, Toastmasters.
Thank you, Toastmasters.
Thank you, Toastmasters, for giving me so much confidence.
Thank you, Toastmasters, for everything.